The son betrays the mother, and she is unjustly imprisoned. Years later, he returns to claim the inheritance, but... Hello, welcome. Don't forget to subscribe and activate notifications. Years ago, a son named Robert accused his mother Ariana of a crime she did not commit, which led to her imprisonment. Years later, Robert returned to claim the inheritance, but the lawyer had a surprise prepared for him. When the dawn broke through the worn curtains of Ariana's modest house, full of stories of sacrifice and love, the smell of coffee filled the kitchen. Every corner of the house whispered stories of sacrifice and love. Ariana, with hands hardened by years of work, prepared breakfast in the almost deafening silence, broken only by the distant singing of birds. She looked at the empty chair in front of her, where her late husband used to sit when her son Robert was just a boy. If only you were here, Ariana thought, whispering a brief prayer in his memory. Robert, now a teenager, came down the stairs quickly, casting side glances at his mother. The distance between them was palpable. He was no longer the sweet boy who ran into her arms. His eyes, once bright, now reflected disdain and frustration. He sat in front of her, eating indifferently, without saying a word. "Did you sleep well, son?" Ariana asked with a gentle smile, trying to break the ice. Robert briefly looked up but did not respond, lost in his thoughts. Ariana watched him with concern, knowing that something had changed since he began to associate with his wealthy school friends. He had begun to show signs of resentment, ashamed of their poverty, and was growing more distant from her. Ariana tried to understand him, but the silent separation hurt her. Robert recalled the taunts from his classmates for not having the latest phone or branded clothes. Every comment, every superior look weighed on him like a stone. Meanwhile, he saw his mother working tirelessly in her small shop, but that was not enough for him. His mind was set on a future where he wouldn't have to worry about survival, where he would have everything effortlessly. "Tomorrow I have a presentation at school, and I need money for decent clothes. I can't go dressed like this," Robert said abruptly, interrupting his mother's thoughts. Ariana looked at him kindly, but with the sadness of knowing she couldn't give him what he wanted. Money was tight, the bills were piling up, and despite working herself to the bone, she barely managed to stay afloat. "Robert, you know how things are, but I'll see if I can get an advance from the shop," Ariana replied with a heavy heart. Robert scoffed, clearly frustrated. To him, his mother didn't understand. He lived in a world where appearances were everything, and in his mind, his life would remain stuck if he relied on the little Ariana could offer him. "You don't understand, Mom. It's always the same, we're always tight on money. I'm tired of living like this," Robert exploded, standing up from the table with such force that the plates shook. Ariana remained silent, feeling a stab in her heart with each word. It wasn't the first time she had heard such reproaches, but it hurt more every time. "Son, I know it's not easy, but I'm doing everything I can. What's important is not what we have, but who we are. Money doesn't define a person," she tried to explain calmly. Robert rolled his eyes. His mother's values now felt empty, irritating. To him, they were just words poor people used to justify their situation. He couldn't understand why his mother, who had worked her entire life, was still trapped in the poverty he so despised. "That's what you always say, but what's the point of being a good person if we keep living in this old house, with nothing?" He replied harshly, grabbing his backpack and heading for the door. Ariana watched him leave the house without looking back, without saying goodbye. She sighed deeply, looking at the door, hoping that at any moment Robert would come running back to hug her, like he used to. But she knew those days were long gone. Something dark was growing inside him, something she didn't understand but that filled her with a silent fear. As Robert walked through the neighborhood toward school, his mind was consumed with thoughts of ambition and success. He thought of his friends, of the luxury cars their parents drove, of the big, modern houses they lived in. He felt he deserved something like that, he told himself bitterly. He was convinced that his mother not only couldn't give him that life, but she was the one keeping him trapped in poverty. He began to hate her for that, for not understanding his desires, for not giving him what he believed he deserved. That afternoon, after school, Robert met some friends at a luxurious downtown cafe. They talked about parties, trips, and expensive clothes while he tried to fit into their conversations, but every word reminded him of how different his life was. Then, one of his friends, David, made a comment that sparked something in Robert. "You know, Robert, if I had an inheritance like yours, I wouldn't be sitting here. My life would be very different," David said, half joking. Robert looked up, intrigued. "Inheritance?" he asked. "Yeah, that property your mother has. I know it's not much, but if you knew how to use it, you could do something big with it." Robert had never thought of the small property his mother cared for as a source of power, but those words planted a seed in his mind. Maybe, just maybe, if he managed to get rid of his mother and take control, he could start building the life he had always wanted. The seed of betrayal was planted, and Robert began to imagine a future where Ariana, his mother, was no longer there to hold him back. Weeks passed, and the distance between Robert and his mother only grew. Every conversation was colder, every gesture more distant. Consumed by his ambitions and frustrations, Robert spent little time at home, avoiding his mother whenever he could. He increasingly sought refuge in his new social circle, a group of young people living on the edge, seeking easy, fast money, no matter the cost. One night, while he was with David and his friends in a bar, the conversation took an unexpected turn. Amid laughter and careless comments, one of the friends, Robert, mentioned an idea that immediately caught Robert's attention. "I've got a proposal, guys. My cousin and I have been thinking of doing something productive, if you catch my drift," Robert said with a mischievous smile, his eyes gleaming with a mix of adrenaline and danger. Robert, who had been staring at his phone, looked up, intrigued. "What kind of productive?" he asked, trying to sound casual, though his interest was growing. Robert leaned forward, lowering his voice. "There's a house on the outskirts, a mansion. The owners are on vacation for a few weeks. If we play our cards right, we could get in, take what we need, and get out without a trace. We just need a few more hands, and we could make a lot of money." Robert felt adrenaline coursing through his veins. Robert's words captivated him. He could imagine himself walking away from that heist with a nice haul, maybe enough to start building the life he had always dreamed of. It was a tempting, though dangerous, opportunity. "And how safe is this?" Robert asked, not hiding his interest. "Safe, if we do it right," Robert replied confidently. "We're not talking about a mansion with extreme security. It's a house in a luxury neighborhood, but without state-of-the-art security systems. The owners aren't even in the country. We just need to be quick and discreet." Robert remained silent for a moment, thinking. His friends watched him, waiting for his response. He knew this decision would mark a turning point. If he got involved, there would be no turning back. But he also knew that if he stayed on the path he was on, living under his mother's roof, with no prospects for improving his situation, he wouldn't get what he wanted. He had to do something. "I'm in," he finally said, his voice firm. The others smiled, satisfied. They had a complete team. The following days were a whirlwind of emotions and preparation. Robert and David took care of gathering the necessary details for the robbery, while Robert, for the first time, felt that he had control over his future. His mind was no longer on the small house he shared with his mother, but on the mansion, on the money they would take, and on the life he could start building. The night of the heist arrived. Robert and his friends gathered in a dark alley near the mansion. The air was tense but also strangely exciting. The plan was simple: get in, take what they could, and get out before anyone noticed. They had studied every detail, and the house seemed like an easy target. They entered without any problems. The immense and luxurious house was silent. Robert looked around, amazed by the wealth surrounding him, while his friends hurriedly collected jewelry, watches, and cash. Everything seemed to be going smoothly, until an unexpected noise broke the stillness. A man appeared in the hallway. He was the caretaker of the mansion, who, although supposedly out of the country, had unexpectedly returned. Chaos erupted. In the confusion, one of Robert's friends, in a desperate act, hit the caretaker on the head with a heavy object. The man fell to the ground, unconscious. But it wasn't just a blow. The caretaker was no longer breathing. He was dead. Panic enveloped them. Robert felt everything crumbling. The plan that had seemed so simple had turned into a nightmare. The terrified friends began to flee, leaving the caretaker's body on the floor. Robert, his hands trembling, ran out of the mansion, his heart pounding, and sweat running down his forehead. He knew they were in serious trouble, he knew there was no way out of this. But then, a dark idea crossed his mind. As he ran toward his house, his thoughts became clearer. The chaos, the death, the robbery, it could all become an opportunity. Robert knew that if he played his cards right, if he manipulated the evidence correctly, he could frame his mother. If Ariana disappears from my life, all of this will be mine, he thought, not letting guilt catch up with him. Hours later, in the darkness of the night, Robert entered his house. His mother was asleep, unaware of the disaster that was about to unfold. With calculated precision, Robert began hiding some of the stolen jewelry in different parts of the house, under his mother's bed, in the closet, in the kitchen drawers. Then, calmly, he erased any trace of his involvement in the crime. As he left the house, he paused for a moment, staring at the closed door, a mixture of excitement and fear running through his body. He knew that what he was doing was irreversible. He knew that within hours, the police would arrive, and everything would change forever. He walked into the early morning, knowing that his mother, the woman who had raised, protected, and loved him, would be the one to pay for the crime he had committed. The sun had barely risen when a loud knock on the door woke Ariana. The feeling of a peaceful morning was quickly replaced by an inexplicable unease. She got out of bed, her heart pounding, without knowing why. Robert hadn't come home yet, she had heard him come in late the night before, but hadn't dared to confront him. When she opened the door, she was met by two uniformed police officers, with serious and determined faces. "Ariana Maxwell?" one of the officers asked, while the other observed her with a cold, analytical look. "Yes, that's me," Ariana replied, her voice trembling, not understanding what was happening. "We have a warrant for your arrest. You are under suspicion of robbery and murder." The words fell like a bucket of cold water on Ariana. Her mind went blank. Robbery? Murder? Those words made no sense. She tried to find an explanation, but the only thing that came to mind was her routine life, the shop, Robert, and the effort she made every day to survive. "There must be a mistake, I haven't done anything," she stammered, her voice breaking with panic. The police didn't give her time to protest further. Within minutes, handcuffs surrounded her wrists, and Ariana was escorted to the patrol car, while her neighbors watched from their windows, with confused and surprised looks. The murmur of people beginning to gather on the street only heightened the sense of unreality that enveloped her. As they took her to the car, Ariana looked up, desperately searching for Robert. He was the only thing she could think of. Where was he? Did he know what was happening? Could he help clear up this misunderstanding? Hours later, at the police station, Ariana was interrogated relentlessly. The evidence presented by the police was overwhelming, the jewelry found in her home, her fingerprints on the stolen items, everything pointed to her involvement in the crime. Desperate, Ariana tried to convince them of her innocence, but the more she tried, the more it seemed like her words fell on deaf ears. "I don't know anything about this, please, you have to believe me." "It's a mistake," she repeated over and over, tears in her eyes. "Ariana, the facts are clear, the jewelry was in your house, and the evidence indicates that you were involved in the robbery," one of the officers said coldly. Each new accusation was like a blow to the chest. Ariana felt the ground crumbling beneath her feet. She had never imagined she would find herself in a situation like this, trapped in a legal process for something she hadn't done. Deep in her mind, fear was growing. Where was Robert? Why hadn't he shown up to help her? She knew her son always came home late, but this was different. He should have been there, explaining the truth. "Call my son, he'll tell you this is a mistake," she pleaded, her voice breaking more and more. Time passed, but Robert didn't appear. Ariana couldn't know that at that very moment, Robert was watching from afar, hidden in the shadows of his own lie. He knew the police would arrive at the house sooner or later, he knew his mother would be arrested, and yet, he did nothing. A part of him felt a pang of guilt, but his ambition drowned it out. Robert watched as his plan unfolded perfectly, while Ariana fought for her freedom. He was preparing to take control of the family's assets, the last obstacle that, in his mind, kept him tied to a life of limitation. He convinced himself that everything he had done was for his own good, that his mother's sacrifice was just the necessary price to achieve the life he had always wanted. The day of the trial arrived quickly. Ariana, physically and emotionally exhausted, sat in the courtroom, watching the case against her unfold before her eyes. The defense lawyer she had managed to get, Jake, was a skilled man, but even he knew they were at a disadvantage. The prosecution presented the evidence relentlessly, the jewelry found in her home, the fingerprints, the connections that seemingly indicated Ariana had been involved in the robbery. Each new piece of evidence made Ariana feel smaller, more powerless. She looked around the courtroom, searching for a familiar face, someone who would offer a ray of hope. But Robert was not there. The young man, for his part, was present at the trial, but his attitude was cold and distant. He didn't approach his mother, didn't try to comfort her or explain anything. To him, this was all part of the plan. He knew that the more distant he remained, the more credible it would be that he had nothing to do with the crime. Ariana looked at him from across the courtroom, hoping, praying that he would say something, that he would explain what was happening. But Robert kept a passive face, his eyes cold, showing not the slightest hint of the compassion he once felt for her. That indifference shattered her inside. How had it come to this? Ariana asked herself repeatedly, trying to find an answer to the betrayal she felt. The verdict didn't take long to arrive. The evidence was clear, and Robert's manipulations had been perfect. The judge, with an implacable voice, delivered the sentence. Ariana was sentenced to years in prison for robbery, complicity, and murder. The sound of the gavel hitting the table echoed in Ariana's mind like an endless echo. Her legs trembled as the guards approached to escort her out of the courtroom. Her pale face, tears running down her cheeks, sought one last look from her son, one last word to help her understand. But Robert said nothing, made no effort to stop or defend her, simply watching her as if she were no longer part of his life. And in that moment, Ariana understood, Robert had betrayed her. Her own son had delivered her to the claws of justice. Now, as they took her to prison, he would be left with everything she had built. Ariana was taken to prison, her mind full of unanswered questions, her heart broken by the cruelest betrayal. The prison doors closed behind her, and with that sound, a part of her life was left behind. In her cell, Ariana sat in a corner, staring at the cold gray walls that surrounded her. She knew her fight was just beginning, but in that moment, all she could feel was the deep pain of having lost not only her freedom, but also her son. The metallic sound of the doors closing echoed in Ariana's ears like a sentence. She never imagined she would find herself behind those cold, hostile walls. Sitting on a small iron bed, she observed the limited space of her new home, a soulless gray-walled cell that seemed to absorb any trace of hope. Outside, the world kept spinning, but for Ariana, time had stopped at the moment she heard the sentence. Every morning, the sound of keys and the voices of the guards pulled her from her light sleep. The first weeks were torment for Ariana. She couldn't understand how she had ended up there. The images of the trial, the evidence against her, and above all, Robert's coldness, played over and over in her mind like a nightmare she couldn't wake from. In her daily life, her existence was reduced to surviving, to fulfilling the assigned tasks, to keeping her head down and avoiding trouble with the other inmates. But the biggest battle she fought wasn't against the other prisoners, but against the thoughts that tormented her in every moment of solitude. Often, in the darkness of the night, when the silence was deep, she remembered Robert as a boy, the little one who would run into her arms after a bad day, seeking comfort. How had it come to this? Where had she gone wrong as a mother? The pain of the betrayal was almost unbearable. For years, Ariana had sacrificed so much for her son, dedicating her life to giving him a chance to get ahead, to become someone. And now, the same person for whom she had fought had put her in a cell, burying her in a lie she didn't know if she could dismantle. One afternoon, while sweeping the prison yard, an older woman with scars on her face and a hard look approached Ariana. "You're the new one, right?" the woman asked directly. Ariana nodded, unsure of what to expect. "I've been watching you. You don't seem like the type that belongs here," said the woman. "I'm not," Ariana whispered, barely audible. The woman let out a brief laugh, but without joy. "We all say that at first. The difference is that some, like you, really shouldn't be here." The woman's name was Angela, and little by little, she began to get closer to Ariana. Although prison life was hard, and the hierarchies among the inmates were usually cruel, Angela saw something in Ariana that set her apart from the others. Over the years, Angela had met many women who had fallen due to mistakes or the manipulation of others, and something in Ariana's eyes told her she wasn't guilty. Through their conversations, Ariana began to understand that she wasn't the only one who had been a victim of a system that, at times, worked unjustly. Angela told her stories of other inmates, women who had been convicted of crimes they didn't commit or who received disproportionate sentences due to their lack of resources to defend themselves adequately. These stories resonated in Ariana's heart. Though the wound from Robert's betrayal was still fresh, she began to see her situation with more clarity. One afternoon, while Ariana and Angela were resting on a bench in the yard, Angela looked at her curiously. "And you? What brought you here?" Ariana, who until then had avoided talking about her case, finally decided to share her story. She told Angela everything, how Robert had changed over the years, how his ambition had led him to distance himself from her, and how, finally, he had betrayed her to frame her for a crime she didn't commit. "I did everything for him, and now I'm here," she said, with tears welling up in her eyes, though she tried to hold them back. Angela nodded, showing no surprise. "You're not the first mother I've seen here because of her son. Sometimes the system doesn't see beyond the evidence, but I'll tell you something, if you want to survive here, you can't give up. Holding on to that pain will only destroy you." Angela's words resonated with Ariana. She knew Angela was right. She couldn't keep sinking into despair. As much as it hurt what Robert had done, she couldn't let that consume her completely. There were women like her who had also been trapped in a web of injustices, and though at that moment she didn't see a clear path out, she began to feel a spark of fight ignite within her. One day, Jake, Ariana's lawyer, came to visit her. It was the first time she had seen him since the trial, and though he didn't bring good news, his presence reminded Ariana that not everything was lost. "Ariana, I've been reviewing your case, but I won't lie to you, it's going to be difficult," said Jake, with a sincere expression. "I don't have much hope, Jake," Ariana responded sadly. "My son betrayed me. I don't know how I'll be able to get through this." Jake leaned forward and spoke in a softer tone. "Ariana, not everything is lost. I know this seems impossible, but I've been looking into some of the evidence against you, and it doesn't all add up. I need more time, but I'm convinced there's more behind this." Ariana felt a small spark of hope. It wasn't much, but it was something. Through Jake, she learned that, outside, things weren't going as well for Robert as he had hoped. The success he had imagined wasn't materializing, and his poor decisions were driving him to the brink of financial collapse. Despite everything, Robert hadn't shown remorse or tried to contact her. That fact devastated her, but it also strengthened her conviction that she couldn't give up, not for herself, but for her dignity. Over time, Ariana began to interact more with the other inmates, listening to their stories, sharing her own, and little by little, that broken but resilient community began to give her strength. She was no longer just fighting for her freedom, but for the truth, for her name, and for justice for all the women who had been stripped of their dignity. Angela, her new friend, became a source of strength, teaching her how to survive in that hostile environment, but also reminding her that, though the system had broken them, they couldn't let it take their spirit. Ariana, who at first seemed resigned to her fate, began to show signs of resistance. It wasn't an easy fight, her love for Robert still lingered, and the internal battle between her desire to forgive him and her need for justice was a constant torture. Each night, before bed, she wrote letters she never sent, letters addressed to Robert, in which she expressed her pain, her confusion, and her hope that he would somehow come to his senses. But those letters never reached his hands, because deep down, Ariana knew that expecting remorse from Robert was becoming increasingly remote. Robert quickly adapted to the new life he had wanted so much. After Ariana's conviction, there were no longer any major obstacles separating him from taking control of the family properties and assets she had left behind. For Robert, it seemed the plan had gone perfectly. With Ariana out of his life, he finally had what he always wanted, freedom and control. However, what he didn't anticipate was that this apparent victory would begin to crumble almost as quickly as it had arrived. The first days after Ariana's conviction were a mix of euphoria and relief. Robert enjoyed the feeling of independence, of finally being in charge, and began to spend the money now at his disposal without thinking twice. He bought designer clothes, threw parties with his friends, and started frequenting exclusive places he had only dreamed of entering. In his mind, he was building the life he always wanted. However, it didn't take long for the cracks to appear. What Robert hadn't considered was that, though his mother had lived modestly, she had managed the family businesses and finances with great care and prudence. Robert, on the other hand, lacked that experience and had the arrogant attitude of someone who believed the money was endless. One afternoon, Robert received a call from one of the managers of the family businesses Ariana had left under his control. Initially, Robert ignored the call, but as the messages piled up, he knew something was wrong. "Mr. Maxwell, we need to urgently talk about the latest financial reports. The businesses are in a more delicate situation than we anticipated, and some of the recent decisions are making things worse," one of the messages said. Annoyed by the insistence, Robert finally decided to attend the meeting with the managers. As he entered the conference room, his usual air of superiority remained intact, but the concerned faces of the employees began to unsettle him. "What's going on?" Robert asked, not hiding his impatience. One of the managers, an older man who had worked with Ariana for years, looked at him seriously. "Mr. Maxwell, we've noticed that you've been withdrawing large sums of money for personal expenses, which has affected the reserves we maintain to cover the business's operational costs. Additionally, some of the investment decisions you've made, like buying risky stocks, haven't yielded the expected results." Robert frowned, irritated. "That's not a problem. I just need more time for the investments to pay off," he replied, unwilling to acknowledge the severity of the situation. "Sir, if you continue withdrawing money this way, the businesses won't be able to stay afloat. We're reaching the point where we could face bankruptcy, and we don't have enough funds to cover the debts." The manager's words hit Robert like a bomb. Everything he had built, everything he believed he had under control, was crumbling before his eyes. The bad decisions he had made, trusting that the money would always be there, were driving him to the brink of ruin. Meanwhile, the social circle Robert had cultivated, those friends who once admired him for his success, began to disappear. The parties and luxuries that Robert initially offered became less frequent, and those who surrounded him only out of convenience started looking for new opportunities. The calls became less frequent, the invitations stopped coming, and Robert began to notice a loneliness he hadn't perceived before. One night, as he walked alone through the streets, remembering the moments when he was ashamed of the humble life he lived with his mother, Robert felt an emptiness. He had achieved what he always wanted, but instead of the satisfaction he had imagined, he only felt a growing desperation. He realized he wasn't prepared to handle what he had taken. His life, once full of expectations of greatness, now seemed to be collapsing. A few days later, Robert received an official notice from one of the family business's creditors. The debt had reached a critical point, and he was informed that if he didn't pay what he owed, legal action would be taken. Robert, who had already exhausted much of the available money on personal expenses, had no way to cover the debt. He began desperately looking for a solution, but every door he knocked on was closed. The rich friends who once accompanied him to his parties didn't answer his calls. The influential people who had been part of his circle avoided him, knowing he no longer had anything to offer. Robert was alone. The financial collapse wasn't the only thing crumbling in Robert's life. The tension and pressure began to affect his mental health. The nights became endless, filled with insomnia and anxiety. He woke up in the middle of the night drenched in sweat, with the image of his mother crossing his mind over and over. No matter how much he tried to justify what he had done, he couldn't escape the feeling that everything that was happening was a consequence of his own actions. The remorse began to torment him, though he wasn't willing to admit it. As his life fell apart, Robert realized that, despite having removed his mother from his life, her shadow remained, reminding him of everything he had done. One afternoon, as he aimlessly walked through the city, Robert passed by his mother's shop. The shop, where Ariana had spent her days working tirelessly, was now closed, with windows covered in dust and empty shelves. Robert stopped in front of the entrance, feeling a lump in his throat. Memories of his childhood hit him hard. He remembered the days when his mother taught him to work with humility, the moments when she sacrificed her own well-being to give him a better life. He remembered the times when he despised her for not giving him more, for not being what he expected. And now the shop was empty, just like his life. What have I done? He muttered to himself, feeling the weight of his guilt for the first time. But the realization of his failure came too late. The businesses were on the verge of bankruptcy, and the debts kept piling up. The life Robert had tried to build through betrayal and greed was crumbling, and no one was around to help him. He had betrayed the only person who loved him unconditionally, and in the process, had destroyed himself. Time in prison for Ariana continued to move slowly, as if each day were a repeat of the previous one. The hours stretched between the assigned tasks, conversations with Angela, and the thoughts that wouldn't leave her in peace. However, the small spark of hope ignited by Jake in his last visit still burned inside her. She knew her lawyer was still searching for a way out, though each day without news was another test of patience and endurance. One afternoon, while Ariana was returning from working in the prison kitchen, a guard called out to her. "Maxwell, you have a visitor," the man said with a harsh but formal voice. Ariana's heart skipped a beat. She wasn't expecting anyone. She thought of Jake, but she didn't have any meetings scheduled with him. Nervously, she walked to the visiting room, her mind running through all possible scenarios. However, when she entered the room, it wasn't Jake waiting for her. On the other side of the glass sat a young woman with a determined look and an intense expression. "Hello, Mrs. Maxwell. I'm Evelyn Smith," the young woman said, extending her hand toward the glass, though both knew they couldn't touch. "I'm a journalist, and I'm here to help you." Ariana looked at her skeptically at first, unsure of how to react. She had heard stories of journalists who only wanted to exploit other people's misfortunes, but something in Evelyn's eyes gave her confidence. There was a strength, a conviction, that she hadn't seen in a long time. "Jake, your lawyer, told me about your case," Evelyn continued. "I've been investigating on my own, and I believe I can help uncover the truth." Ariana sat down slowly, her hands trembling as she listened to those words. After so much time in prison, the simple fact that someone else, a stranger, believed in her innocence, in addition to Jake, was a relief she didn't know if she could bear. "How can you help me?" Ariana asked, her voice breaking with contained emotion. Evelyn settled into her chair and began explaining what she had been investigating. From the very beginning, Evelyn had felt that there was something strange about Ariana's case. She had reviewed the trial reports and found several inconsistencies in the evidence presented, things that, when mentioned to Jake, they both agreed didn't fit. "There are things that don't add up," Evelyn said, taking out a small notebook. "The evidence was too perfect, so to speak. The stolen items found in your house were too neatly placed, as if they had been put there on purpose." Ariana nodded slowly. Although she had always known she was innocent, hearing someone else, a stranger, confirm that idea in a rational and logical way made her feel, for the first time, that someone was paying attention. "Also," Evelyn continued, "I discovered that some of the witnesses who testified against you are connected to your son, Robert. One of them, a former friend of your son, has been avoiding answering direct questions since I started investigating." Ariana tensed at the mention of Robert's name. Despite everything that had happened, a part of her still hoped he would show up to help her, that this was all a misunderstanding. But as Evelyn spoke, the pieces began to fall into place in a way that Ariana didn't want to admit. "Robert?" Ariana whispered, almost breathless. The idea that her son was directly involved in framing her, that he had done it consciously, was a pain she couldn't bear. Evelyn saw Ariana's reaction and softened her tone. "Mrs. Maxwell, I know this is hard to hear, but we have to be realistic if we want to get you out of here. Jake and I believe that Robert not only was involved in this robbery, but also may have manipulated the evidence to frame you." Ariana broke down emotionally at that moment. She had always known, deep in her heart, that Robert played a significant role in her downfall. But hearing the possibility that he had planned it so precisely left her devastated. Tears began to run down her cheeks, and though she tried to hold them back, she couldn't. "I just wanted him to have a better life," Ariana sobbed. "Everything I did was for him, so he wouldn't suffer. How could he do this to me?" Evelyn, seeing Ariana in that state, allowed her to cry in silence for a few moments before speaking again. "I can't imagine the pain you're feeling," Evelyn said softly, "but if you want to regain your freedom, we're going to need your strength. We can't let Robert continue his life as if none of this ever happened. He not only betrayed you, Mrs. Maxwell. He manipulated many people, and he must face the consequences." Ariana slowly lifted her head, wiping her tears with the sleeves of her prison uniform. She felt like her heart was broken, but she also knew that Evelyn was right. She couldn't give up. She couldn't let Robert get away with it, no matter how much it hurt to face him. Her freedom and the justice she deserved depended on her determination to fight. "What can I do?" Ariana asked, her voice still trembling but with a new spark of resolve in her eyes. Evelyn smiled slightly, knowing they had reached the crucial point. "We're going to work with Jake to gather all the necessary evidence, but there's a key person we need. A man named Michael, who was friends with Robert when all this happened, and we know he knows more than he's said so far. If we can get him to talk, we might have the key piece we need to dismantle the entire plan." The following days were a whirlwind of activity for Evelyn and Jake. They both worked tirelessly to find Michael and get him to talk. However, Michael wasn't easy to locate. He had distanced himself from Robert after everything that had happened and was living in anonymity, clearly dealing with the guilt of what had occurred. Every lead they followed led to dead ends, but neither Evelyn nor Jake was willing to give up. Finally, after weeks of searching, Evelyn and Jake managed to find Michael. He lived in a suburban neighborhood, far from everything, leading a discreet life. When Evelyn confronted him, Michael was initially reluctant to talk, afraid of the repercussions. But Evelyn, with her ability to empathize and her firm approach, gradually got Michael to open up. What Michael revealed was devastating, but also the key they needed. He confirmed what Evelyn and Jake had suspected: Robert had manipulated everything from the beginning. He had used the death during the robbery as an opportunity to get rid of his mother and take control of the family assets. Michael, having been under Robert's influence and afraid of what they would do if he spoke up, had remained silent. But the years of guilt had consumed him, and now he was ready to tell the truth. Ariana, in her small cell, felt trapped not only by the walls surrounding her but by the thoughts swirling in her mind like an uncontrollable storm. Evelyn and Jake's words had opened a wound that, though always present, now felt deeper and more painful than ever. She knew that Robert had played a crucial role in her conviction, but accepting that it had all been a betrayal planned by her own son was something that destroyed her inside. The air in the prison was cold and dense that night, and as Ariana lay on her iron bed, tears began to run down her face. She had fought so hard for Robert, sacrificing everything to give him a better life. She had taught him the values she believed in: honesty, hard work, kindness. But somewhere along the way, those values were lost to him. When had Robert changed so much? How had he allowed ambition and hatred to consume him to the point of destroying her, his own mother? The letters she had written to Robert, letters she never sent, piled up in a corner of her cell. Each one was a reflection of her pain, but also of her hope. She had tried, with every word written, to find some trace of the boy he used to be, the son she loved before greed changed him. But with each passing letter, that hope faded a little more. That night, as she tried to sleep, a thought struck her: if Evelyn and Jake's investigation succeeded, it wouldn't only prove her innocence but also expose Robert's guilt. The idea that her son could be arrested and tried for what he had done was unbearable. Though he had betrayed her in the cruelest way, he was still her son. How could she face the fact that he would pay for his crimes? The maternal love she felt for Robert was a bond that couldn't easily be broken. Though reason told her she needed to fight for her freedom, that Robert deserved to face the consequences of his actions, her heart couldn't help but feel deeply conflicted. How could she condemn the son she had dedicated her life to? How could she allow him to suffer, knowing that it would destroy him? It was a battle between her maternal love and the need for justice. The next day, as she carried out her tasks in the prison, Angela, the inmate who had become her friend and confidant, noticed Ariana's unease. She knew something was eating at her. "You're quieter than usual today," Angela said, approaching as they both cleaned the yard. Ariana looked at her, and for a moment, she thought about saying nothing. But she knew she couldn't keep those thoughts to herself. "It's Robert," Ariana murmured, her eyes full of anguish. "If Evelyn and Jake's investigation succeeds, he'll be the one to pay. And I don't know if I can bear that." Angela nodded slowly, understanding the pain Ariana felt. She was a mother too and knew the unconditional love a mother felt for her child, even in the worst circumstances. "It's normal to feel that way, he's your son after all," Angela said, leaning on the broom she held, "but you also have to think of yourself. He betrayed you, put you here, and hasn't even had the decency to regret it." "I know," Ariana replied, her voice broken, "but how can I condemn him? He's still my son, and though it hurts what he did, the thought of seeing him suffer, of seeing him in prison, is something I can't bear. I raised him, I loved him, and I can't stop loving him, even though he hurt me so much." Angela sighed, understanding the depth of Ariana's internal struggle. She stepped closer and put a hand on her shoulder. "Sometimes, a mother's love is the hardest thing to face, but Ariana, he chose this path. You didn't push him to do what he did. There comes a moment in every child's life when they have to take responsibility for their decisions. You can't carry the burden of his actions." Ariana nodded, but the knot in her chest didn't loosen. She knew Angela was right. Robert had made his own decisions, and those decisions had destroyed her. But that didn't make the pain of his betrayal any less intense. That night, back in her cell, Ariana sat in front of her small pile of letters. She knew she had to make a decision. She took a blank sheet and began writing a new letter, this time with a clarity she hadn't had before. "Dear Robert, I don't know if this letter will ever reach your hands, but I feel I need to write these words, even if it's only for myself. I've loved you more than words can express since you were born. You were my light, my reason for being. Everything I did was for you, for your future. I always wanted to give you a better life, to give you opportunities one never had. I taught you the best I could about honesty, effort, and kindness, and somewhere along the way, those values were lost to you. I know what you did. I know it was you who put me here. I can't understand why or accept that my son would betray me this way. It hurts more than you can imagine, but I still love you. That hasn't changed, you're my son and always will be. However, there's something I must do, not only for myself, but for the truth and my dignity. I can't let this lie continue. I must clear my name, fight for my freedom, and I know that in doing so, I will expose your actions. I don't know if I'll ever be able to forgive myself for that, but I have no choice. I hope that one day you can understand the damage you've caused me. I hope you find your way back to the boy you once were, the boy I loved with all my heart. Perhaps, one day, you can regret what you've done. With love, Mom. Ariana carefully folded the letter and placed it with the others, knowing she would probably never send it. Writing it had been a necessary step. The internal struggle she had been facing hadn't ended, but at least now she had clarity about what she needed to do. That night, as she tried to sleep, something inside her changed. She knew it wouldn't be easy to face Robert and accept that her son would have to pay for what he had done, but she also knew she couldn't keep being the victim. She had to fight for her freedom, and if Robert was guilty, then he would have to take responsibility for his decisions, just as she had taught him since he was a child. Ariana's internal battle continued, but she no longer felt so trapped by guilt. For the first time in a long time, she felt she had control over her destiny, even though the path to justice would be painful and full of sacrifice. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel, give it a like, and activate the notification bell so you don't miss our upcoming videos. A big kiss, and see you in the next story.